LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Samuel Alexander, who joins us to discuss his new book, Entropia. When industrial civilization collapsed in the third decade of the 21st century, a community living on a small island in the South Pacific found itself permanently isolated from the rest of the world. With no option but to build a self-sufficient economy with very limited energy supplies, this community set about creating a simpler way of life that could flourish deep into the future. Determined above all else to transcend the materialistic values of the old world, they made a commitment to live materially simple lives, convinced that this was the surest path to genuine freedom, peace, and sustainable prosperity. 7 decades later, in the year 2099, Entropia describes the results of their remarkable living experiment. Hello and welcome, Sam, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
My pleasure, thanks for having me.
Sam, today we're going to discuss your new book, Entropia, Life Beyond Industrial Civilization. Perhaps to get us started, you could just give us a little bit of your background and how you actually came to write the book.
I moved to Melbourne from New Zealand in 2006 to begin my PhD in Melbourne Law School, of all places. And as I undertook my doctoral studies, I moved more away from legal study and more into interdisciplinary analyses. And I got interested in limits to growth analysis in particular, and sustainable consumption and energy issues. And over the last few years, I've been writing mainly academic papers and books through an institution called the Simplicity Institute, where we focus on trying to flesh out the details of what a post-growth, radically simple, low energy, low resource consumption society would look like. And through that academic work, I began getting interested more in the envisioning process, because it's all very well to lay down long essays and heavily footnoted academic treatises, and another thing to try to, which I think is an essential part of the debate. Obviously, it has to be rigorous in the evidential foundations of an alternative society, and rigorous in analysing how to theorise the transition and to work out the best strategy for transitioning to an alternative, just, sustainable society. But I felt somewhat constricted by the conventions of academic writing, and am aware, as any academic is, that some people like reading academic literature, most people don't. And I felt the importance of the issues were such that I should at least try to write a bit more creatively and a bit more in an attempt to engage a broader audience with these issues that I'm convinced are important. And that led me to dare to write a book, which in a sense is, I'm finding it hard to classify when people ask me what type of book Entropia is, because it's fiction, but it isn't a novel as such. And that is where the dilemma lies in how I explain it, because it's essentially pitched from the future. It's set in 2099, and I'm looking back and describing a society that arose after the collapse of industrial civilization, and try to almost document, the culture, the economy, the politics, the spirituality of this low consumption, low energy society, rather than a conventional novel by any sense, even though it is fiction.
The premise of the book, really, as you've been outlining, is the sort of what I call the myth of progress, really, which is the idea that for industrial civilization, that it's onwards and upwards to a glorious techno-utopian future. But really, the evidence all around us, staring us in the face everywhere we look, is that that's not going to happen. And I think what your book does is it reminds us of that, but it also says that the future doesn't have to be apocalyptically bleak, that we are in control of our destiny. Whatever we say about what's happening to the climate and the environment, we do have a lot of choices here, and it's really about the path that we choose to take from this point onwards.
Yeah, as you would have seen by reading it, it takes quite a broad, big picture perspective, and it begins in the chapter 2 where we get into the sort of the critique of industrial civilization, that it sketches the evolution of human civilization briefly, obviously, but looking at the progress of our consumption habits and practices in particular. And obviously, when people are desperately poor, when people are hungry, when people don't have enough clothes, when people are cold, they want more stuff. And by acquiring more stuff, more food, warmer clothing, better shelter, access to basic medical care and this type of thing, that tends to improve people's lives. And what that gives rise to is the assumption that further material gains will also produce continuing sort of quality of life increases. And both for thousands of years in the philosophical traditions and more recently in the social sciences and the empirical studies, there's this interesting body of work that suggests that while increasing income at low levels of income does increase our quality of life, there comes a point, a surprisingly low point, where that correlation fades, whereby getting richer beyond a point stops contributing to our quality of life or our well-being. And yet civilization still seems to be entrenched in a model that assumes that in order to improve our lives, in order to improve our society, and in order to progress as a nation or as a culture or as a human community, we need to continually get richer in a material sense. And for some time, there was some grounds for thinking that that was an appropriate model to govern our economies, our societies, our cultures. But there have now been decades of research to suggest that that correlation between wealth and well-being has begun to fade and has now begun to turn back on itself. The problem is that it's very difficult to get out of that mindset. When things seem to be going wrong, the assumption remains, well, we need more to fix those problems. It doesn't dawn on many people to think that, well, perhaps the growth model as it once applied no longer applies. We've had for generations, children have grown up thinking that they're going to be better off materially than their parents. And, in some sense, that's a nice vision, that has been the traditional conception of progress. But that is now, as you say, the myth of progress, insofar as it could be that we have either reached the limits to growth economically or have already reached or will soon reach the limits to growth, suggesting that material affluence can no longer be what defines progress, and in fact that the aspiration of globalizing affluence, while once it may have seemed like a legitimate and worthwhile endeavor in an empty world, in a world of 7 billion people, the goal of globalizing affluence strikes me and many others as a suicide pact, because we have not just reached the limits of growth ecologically, but according to the latest ecological footprint analyses, it suggests that we, as a global economy, have exceeded the sustainable carrying capacity of the planet by 50%. If that's so, if the global economy has already exceeded the sustainable carrying capacity of the planet, and we know that there are billions of people who still want to increase their material standards of living just to provide for a minimal but dignified material standard of living, and we know that the world's population is looking like it's going to reach 9 or 10 billion in the next 40 or 50 or 60 years, that's putting so much more pressure on an already overburdened ecosystem. So nothing could be clearer that we need to rethink the growth model, and yet at the same time especially in the political realm, that is a policy option that people dare not speak of. It's just something that important, that a fundamental change away from the growth model is necessary, and yet our politicians dare not mention it.
Now, this is basically relevant here is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And one of the problems we have at the minute is just as we're reaching a sort of a resource and energy crunch in the industrial world, half the world, probably more than half the world, they haven't got the fridge yet. They haven't got the car. They haven't got the lawnmower. They haven't got the holidays. And there's incredible pressure there. I mean, we think of a lot of Latin America and China in particular, India to a degree. There's a lot of pent-up demand there, and the feeling that, we want our sort of 15 minutes, we want our time in the sun. And that in itself, whatever sort of dawning realizations there are in the developed world about some of the issues that we face, there are incredible pressures in the developing world.
Absolutely, and why shouldn't there be, in a sense? It's obviously plain unjust for the global north to say consumer lifestyles are unsustainable for 7 billion people, so we can live it, but you can't. And given that there are so many people living in extreme poverty, when they look at the North American or the British or the Western European or the Australian lifestyles, it's obvious why they would prefer the material comforts that many of us enjoy compared to the poverty that they experience. So although this is a generalization, what needs to happen at a very broad level is not so much that the West or the global North just says the rest of the world cannot have what we have as a material sense. What I feel needs to happen is that we need to transition away from these lifestyles very quickly. And it's not so much telling the rest of the world that they cannot develop or they cannot progress, but they need to understand, as we need to understand, that globalizing first world lifestyles is simply unsustainable. It's no good saying, well, the first world has it, therefore the world must be allowed to have it. I think what needs to happen is that we need to try to develop some conception of one planet living. And part of my point for writing the Entropia book was to actually try to provide some more detail on what one planet living might actually look like, because notions of sustainable development, while perhaps necessary in 1987 when the term entered the international lexicon and brought environmental issues into the public debate, it's pretty clear by now that sustainable development is so vague a term, so imprecise, that it can be essentially be used to mean anything and therefore nothing, and it has lost any critical bite in the sense of trying to direct public policy. And there is, as you mentioned earlier, this notion of the myth of progress, and sustainable development has become infected with that myth of progress, in the sense that many people assume that we can globalize affluence and that technology and efficiency gains are going to somehow allow us to continually expand that high consumption way of life and yet reduce ecological impact at the same time. Empirically, that is highly questionable and in most cases false, and it certainly shouldn't be the faith upon which we shape our global agenda. So by writing Entropia, as I said, what I was trying to do is to actually take a harder look at what one planet living actually consists of, because it's too easy to say, well, we can still live these high consumption lifestyles and technology will just help dematerialize our lifestyles or decouple our lifestyles from ecological impact. So far as that isn't happening, it means that we need to rethink the levels of consumption. And that's where I think people have many obstacles in the way of their imagination when it comes to trying to envision what a truly sustainable material culture would look like. So in Entropia, especially in the early chapters 3 and 4, chapter 3 I talk about the material conditions, and in chapter 4 I talk about the potential of a both low consumption but also high quality of life existence. And I think that's one of the main points that I want people to take away from the book is that everybody wants their material needs met. Nobody wants to be hungry. Nobody wants to be cold. When people are sick, they want access to medical attention, that type of thing. That my argument in favor of material simplicity doesn't contradict that. I'm not arguing for poverty. What I'm arguing is for, as I say in the book, enough for everyone forever. And that implies, in my view, actually quite a radically low, or moderate would be perhaps a better word, material standard of living. And it may shock people when they read chapter 2 and chapter 3 in particular, where I describe in some detail the material way of life on the island of Entropia. But again, in the next chapter where I describe, well, how do they receive this low material standard of living, I try to explain why life can still be very good despite humble material conditions.
Yes, I think a lot of the language about when people do talk about sustainability or post-industrial civilization, it gets couched in terms of lack, what we're going to lose, what we're going to have to give up. And undoubtedly, things do need to change, but it can be still pitched in a very negative way, such that in people's imagination, it just means entirely negative outcomes, less of everything. And there's not so much focus perhaps on what we would gain, materially or otherwise. And just to explain to folks, the scenario in your book is that there's this character called Mortimer Flynn, who is a wealthy industrialist, and he establishes a island community as a sort of experiment to see if the sort of sustainable living that we're talking about is really achievable. And it's interesting at the start of it all, when the community is established, that imports are obviously needed to get things up and running. Modern systems of energy, there's complex machinery, there's infrastructure is constructed to modern standards and with imported materials and technology. And this is an interesting scenario because in one sense it kind of reflects where we are now, because to try and transition into a post-industrial civilization, we're not starting from scratch. I mean, that scenario in the book says that we couldn't start from scratch, but we don't need to. We do have a lot of technology and a lot of materials that we can use. It's just a question of how they are used and on what basis, whether it is sustainable or not.
Yeah, I use the term deindustrial economy to make that point that if it's the case that we have reached the limits of growth and from now on or soon there may be a prolonged contraction of the global economy or certain parts of the economy, it doesn't change the fact that, as you said, there is this huge, vast stock of industrially produced goods which is going to remain. A term that I quite enjoy I got from John Michael Greer, who I believe you interviewed. Is that right?
Yeah, I've had John on a couple of times actually. There's a lot of parallels with his work and what you're doing.
Yeah, so he uses the term, and others use the term, salvage economy to suggest that when people start not being able to have the funds to just say run down to the hardware store to buy some more wood or run to the store to buy some more clothes, you start looking around and realizing that there is an abundance of material goods available for us to refashion or retrofit or to rethink somehow, and we find that our needs can be met in kind of post-consumer ways. It's not a matter of running down to the shop and buying something new. It's about finding that maybe somebody else's waste becomes your treasure, or instead of buying the clothes, you find some fabric and sew your own, or these types of ways of rethinking our consumption practices and perhaps moving away from the consumer model and more towards the producer model.
Well, this is also not something that really has no precedent. This is something that was only recently been abandoned. I mean, to some extent, my parents, but certainly almost completely my grandparents were doing things like repairing kettles and repairing washing machines and, stitching clothes if they, got torn or came undone, rehealing their own shoes, that type of thing. And, it's only relatively recently that things have become either so inexpensive that they're virtually disposable, or basically that they're not designed to be fixed. I spoke with a colleague recently who'd bought a quite an expensive coffee machine, and something had gone wrong with that, and he got in touch with the manufacturers because he's quite handy, and he wanted to get the schematics for it so he could try and fix it, and they refused. They point blank refused. So his only option was, either to take it apart and have a go, throw it in landfill, and pay another, whatever it was, 150, 200 pounds for a new machine. It was a bizarre mentality. It's one thing for to maybe not want to repair a kettle that costs £5, but for an expensive piece of kit like that. But it really spoke of the mentality, the disposable, chuck it away, get a new one that we have.
So many examples of that type of thing too. I got a friend who was trying to explore that type of fixing rather than throwing away idea, and he gathered sort of 5 toasters together and tried to find an electrician or a sort of a fixer who once would have done this, and given that they're so cheap now, to pay somebody to work on it for an hour, you could have bought 2 more toasters. So he found that that type of job had disappeared because nobody would pay $30 to fix a toaster if you could buy 2 new ones for 15. And he also found that there were screws in the toaster that were specific to a particular type of screwdriver. So not a Phillips head or a flat head that everyone has in their shed, but they design a unique screw so that people can't get into it, for the very purpose that you're talking about, designed obsolescence. It's easier to throw away, and there's more profit in the short term for businesses if they get more people throwing away than fixing it. It's bizarre, and our people in the future are going to look back and be very confused.
Perhaps the ultimate example of that is the case now that it very often, if not every time, when computer printers, it's actually cheaper to buy a new printer than it is to buy the cartridge refills for the ink. So even though the ink that comes with the printer won't last as long as a separately bought refill, it's just a bizarre state of affairs. However, I have noticed that this is gradually beginning to change. Now, you wouldn't know it looking at the mainstream media because they don't like to report these things, but I've noticed the increasing rise of repair centres, they're called, which is basically mostly voluntary, and it's people coming together who are concerned about these issues, and they bring together people with skills, handymen, electricians, carpenters, whatever, and they encourage people to come along with their, broken or faulty items, and they'll do whatever they can to try and fix people's, gear, whatever it happens to be.
The notion of reskilling ties in with the transition movement, and we may have an opportunity to talk about that further later, but the transition movement, part of it is about trying to reskill, learn to do things ourselves, repair things ourselves, build things ourselves, grow things ourselves, fix things ourselves in a way that our grandparents just did as a matter of necessity and as a culture. And it's not so much about an attempt to return to the past, but it's about sort of taking the best parts of that type of self-reliance and self-sufficiency and using those skills to navigate the uncertain future.
Yeah, no, you mentioned a few minutes ago the notion of efficiency, and one of the paradoxes about increasing efficiency is that it actually also increases consumption, if we think in terms of fuel or energy. So increased efficiency is really a double-edged sword. I mean, yes, we certainly want things to be more efficient, but there is that issue has to be taken into account, that it's not just a matter of achieving greater efficiency and it is going to lead to falling energy use. The opposite is true. And also the issue of technology, which is often cited as where our salvation is going to come from. As John Michael Greer points out, technology is not energy, and that's really at the nub of this. Energy is the lifeblood of civilization, And, in our case, in our industrial civilization, that means fossil fuels. And whether you subscribe to the information in the peak oil theory or not, we're clearly running into, how shall we say, issues around fossil fuels in terms of like what we can easily get our hands on. And again, whether you subscribe to the theory of, man-made climate change, global warming, call it what you will, there are palpable problems with pollution, which are just, you can't discuss those away. They're there.
Absolutely. And the notion that energy is the lifeblood of civilization is an interesting one, because it's a reminder that we need energy to solve our problems. Like life presents problems, it always has presented problems. And in order to solve those problems, almost always human beings use energy. And that makes the transition away from a high energy consumption lifestyle problematic, or at least challenging, because it requires rethinking how we direct our more limited energy supplies. And it may be that we have less energy through the peaking and eventual decline of oil, inevitable at some stage. The debate is over when that will be and how quickly the descent will be. And even if, as you say, people don't subscribe to a near-term peak in oil, we need to decarbonise very quickly for the reasons of climate change. So decarbonisation is a pretty clear and necessary part of any transition to a sustainable society, but highly challenging for the reason that currently, we use energy to solve our problems, even if the use of that energy can also cause those problems.
Yeah, well, there's a phrase you have in the book talking about the early days of the island community of Entropia, and that is that many of our attempts to build resilience were really little more than pleasant, well-intentioned games. And that kind of struck a chord really as being very much sounding like a lot of the attempts at, greening the economy and energy systems that we have now, because a lot of people, I think, with one eye on the mainstream media, would imagine that, yes, environmental issues and issues of energy consumption are not being dealt with fast enough, but something is being done. They, in inverted commas, are doing something, when if you actually look at the data, energy consumption, CO2 output, what have you, they're actually increasing year on year, despite all the meetings, all the initiatives, everything we hear about in the media. That's increasing year on year. And I think a lot of people will be quite surprised to discover that.
Yeah, and one of the more striking analyses that have come out of the climate science research recently, I think it came out of the Potsdam Institute, and they tried to quantify a carbon budget, and which means that they tried to say, well, how much carbon can we put into the atmosphere and still have a 80% chance of keeping global warming under 2 degrees. And I won't try to draw the exact figures out of my head, but it's something like a third or a fifth of known reserves is the budget, which means that a great percentage of the existing fossil fuels that we have already found can't be burnt if we are to have an 80% chance of avoiding the 2 degrees threshold. And I guess, that raises the question of, well, how are we going to do that? And who is going to burn the remaining carbon budget? Because there is a case can be made that the poorest parts of the world have a greater title, in a sense, to burning that fossil fuels, given that the rich world has squandered so much and is responsible historically for the vast majority of carbon emissions. The developing nations over the last decade or two have certainly caught up in terms of, with China and India and Brazil and nations industrializing very quickly. They're playing their part now in carbon emissions, certainly. But if we were to try to stick to that carbon budget, there's a small fraction of existing reserves that can be burnt. And that raises exceedingly complicated moral and ethical issues about how that budget is going to be distributed. The pragmatic and the realist in me says that, well, the richest and the most powerful are going to burn that share because that's what the richest and powerful have historically done. But as a matter of moral philosophy or ethical evaluation, a case can be made that not only do we have to transition away from fossil fuel intensive economic practices very quickly, but the rich world should be taking the lead on the basis that historically they have emitted so much more than the rest of the world.
Yes, I'd refer listeners to a recent interview I did with Mike Berners-Lee and about his recent book, The Burning Question. And that a revelation in there, which again will be news to a lot of people, is that, as you point out, there's a huge cache of fossil fuels still in the ground. And depending on whose figures you believe, we have to actually walk away from that. And that is an immense problem. It's a bit like, because the mentality is a bit like, say you've got an alcoholic who decides to turn over a new leaf, but in his house there's a bottle of whiskey in the cupboard, and the attitude is almost like, well, I am going to kick the booze, but you know what, I'll just drink that bottle of whiskey so there's no booze in the house, so I won't be tempted.
Yeah, exactly how we're going to get out of this mess is not clear to me, and I guess the book makes it pretty clear that I have a strange mix of pessimism and optimism. Pessimism in the sense that I'm very aware that we've got ourselves into a hell of a lot of trouble. I'm not idealistic in the sense that I think that the transition away from industrial civilization is going to be smooth. It's almost certainly, in my view, going to be punctuated with crises. And it may be that crises are what ends up being the catalyst for the social change and the political and economic changes that are necessary for the world to figure out how to live within one planet and to share its limited resources in a just and humane way.
I think what we're more likely to see, rather than a rapid degeneration into some sort of Mad Max type scenario, is that it's going to be periods of relative stability punctuated by periods of collapse and sudden degeneration, and then that'll level out again. And then at some point, maybe for decades, even for a generation, then there'll be another kind of decline period of upheaval, and so on down. So sort of like a step down process.
Yeah, so there's a fascinating debate that's been taking place over the last few years between people like John Michael Greer, who is certainly he calls it catabolic collapse, and that's sort of the stepwise decline. And his basis for that theory is that historically civilizations have deteriorated not over a few years, but over a few decades, even a century. And his view is that the decline of industrial civilization is going to be, with all its differences, is still going to follow a similar model of decline, where there are others such as Nicole Foss and Gail Tverberg and David Korowicz and others who think that there is something different about industrial civilization. There's something different about the global nature of and the sort of the just-in-time sort of mechanisms of the global economy that make industrial civilization of a different mode, of a different character, historically significantly different from other civilizations, to suggest that a faster and more tragic collapse could be awaiting us. Look, I can't see the future. Sometimes I think when people try to predict either theory too confidently, they are lacking in humility, in the sense that there are so many variables at play that no mere mortal could actually envision or predict with any certainty how the next 20 or 40 or 60 or 80 or 100 years is going to play out. But, a part of me thinks that it may be more towards the John Michael Greer type of scenario because like some of Greer's work is that he says, well, civilizations have sort of a mechanism for adjusting to even significant crises. It's not a matter of just things all shattering at the first sign of a crisis. There's sort of a response time where a civilization or a society will assess the crisis, try to adjust, as you say, stabilize, and then find itself in another crisis at some stage in the future where they then respond again, and it becomes this sort of stepwise decline rather than a sort of a instantaneous or very quick collapse as such. So who knows?
Well, in terms of how we got here, looking at the big picture, there's a few of the key systems underpinning human societies that you analyse in the book, and the inhabitants of the island, how they learn to do things differently. And one of the key turning points, no doubt, in development of society as we have it now, industrial or otherwise, really, it was the development of agriculture. And you mention in the book, from the perspective of hunter-gatherers, the transition to agriculture didn't appear to be such an obvious advance, because certainly in the early days of agriculture, people found themselves fixed in one place, which is, good or bad depending on your perspective, but actually working a lot harder, whereas hunter-gatherers, were spending 2-3 hours a day really hunting or gathering. Really, the men who hunted would spend a little bit more time than the women who gathered, but not a lot. And you posit the question, was agriculture possibly a mistake? And there's a lot of literature along these lines, because that was the thing, arguably, that facilitated the explosion in human population.
Yeah, so in the book I try to paint the agricultural revolution not so much as a revolution in food production, but as a revolution in energy supply. And that leads into the entire book is really pitched in terms of looking at human life and civilization and economic activity in particular in terms of energy. And in the book I try very quickly to sort of raise that point about agriculture being a means of acquiring more energy. And what that did for the first time was to allow the emergence of what some call non-food specialists. And because there was a farming group that was able to, the significant difference between hunter-gathering and agriculture, or one of the significant differences, is that agriculture is much more productive per acre. And that means that a smaller group of people can actually provide for a larger society, and it allows that smaller group to be the food producers, and that frees the rest of the society to do other things. And at first those other things were things like building houses and making better weapons and building baskets and this type of thing, which started creating power imbalances between the agricultural societies and the hunter-gatherer societies. The other thing about agriculture is that it gave the very strong incentive to become sedentary in the sense of non-nomadic. And that also allowed or produced some very significant cultural changes in the sense that hunter-gatherers, the nomadic ones, which was most of them, couldn't really carry much more than they could safely hold in their hands. So there was no good them building houses. It's no good them building 10 types of tools or heavy weapons or this type of thing, because either they couldn't carry all of that stuff around with them, or if they could carry it, it made them slow and then prey to either other tribes or wild animals. But by agriculture sort of fixing a community to the earth and them having to stay there for a while, that sort of gave the incentive to build houses. They were able to accumulate more. It gave rise to notions of property rights, and then property rights needed to be defended, which gave rise to governments and states and police forces. And it's interesting to think of that type of transition in terms of energy. And agriculture was the first energy revolution, really, which did so much to change human civilization, and in many ways it was conventionally classed as the revolution that actually instituted civilization.
Yeah, you mentioned housing, the development of the built environment, and of course in the early days, early civilizations, perhaps a little collection of mud huts wouldn't really remove the inhabitants too far from their immediate environment, from nature as a whole. But that, of course, has changed over the millennia, over the recent centuries, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, with all the growth of the cities and a change from the situation where most people lived in rural circumstances, and that does lead to even a subconscious disconnect, because it really is us and then it's the rest of the world, and we have cut ourselves off.
Yeah, and I guess towards the end of the book, I talk of how the disconnect from nature is arguably one of the precursors to the ecological crisis, insofar as by being so distant from nature, by being inside so much, by not growing so much of our own food, by sitting in front of computers or iPads or iPhones and playing computer games, these forms of technology or these ways of life disconnect us from the elements, from the seasons. Our hands aren't in the soil, and insofar as we don't know nature, it makes it very hard to love nature, and that makes it hard to care or to even see that our ways of life in the industrial world in particular are doing so much damage. And I certainly feel that in order to change our consciousness, our value systems, we need to find ways for our cultures to reconnect with nature, so that we sort of appreciate and be enriched by that connection, and return to the idea that it's obvious that nature is the life support system upon which we all depend, upon which the entire community of life depends. And when you understand that, it becomes obvious that ecological degradation is actually self-harm. But when you don't see that connection between the planet and our livelihood, then it's easier to degrade the planet and think that we'll be fine. Nature's telling us more clearly day by day that ain't so.
Now, you mentioned laws, property rights, governments, but perhaps the most abstract sort of human creation has been our monetary system, because without delving too deeply into the history of money, it started out as something very simple, functional, actually an extremely good idea to move us beyond simple barter. But the way that has evolved now, and particularly how it's run at the minute, it's forgetting all the psychological issues around the notion of perpetual growth, and that's all that governments really talk about today in the teeth of the financial crisis. Got to get back to growth. There's the debt-based nature of money, and our economic system, mathematically, it demands this constant growth. So we really created this huge, weight around our necks, which we could change in the blink of an eye. We could just say that, those debts don't mean anything. They're not to be repaid. Just tear it all up. It's just numbers on a screen. Just press delete. But as long as we're in hock to this, then this perpetual growth model is the only thing that we think will work.
There's still that underlying myth that, growth is the solution to all our problems. When the conventional response to unemployment is more growth. The conventional response to better schools is more growth. The conventional response to, happier lives is more growth. Even the conventional response to environmental problems, as bizarre as it sounds, is more growth, so that governments have more money to invest in environmental protection problems, to invest in renewable energies for individuals with higher incomes so that they can afford their own solar panels, or to buy the more efficient car, these types of things. So we're still very much entrenched in this idea that growth is unquestionably good. And it's seeming to be very hard to free ourselves from that assumption. Whether we do it rationally, as we hopefully will, or whether that happens almost of necessity, in the sense that a post-growth society is not voluntarily embraced but instead imposed upon us. Well, how it plays out remains to be seen, but looking at the world today, looking at the response to the GFC, one gets the suggestion that giving up growth isn't going to be a voluntary transition, in which case we're going to have to deal with it being, the limits to growth being imposed upon us. Like all things, it would be far better if we plan for these types of things. In the absence of that planning and in the absence of that voluntary transition, what will remain is for those, is for us to try to deal with the absence of that voluntary transition. And in a sense, perhaps that's what we're seeing today. There are people, Richard Heimberg, among others, who feel that we have, the limits to growth that were talked about in 1972 by the Club of Rome have actually been reached, and that the global economy will be more or less plateauing for some indeterminate amount of time, after which it will contract, whether we want it to or not. But the response to the GFC and to other energy issues and economic problems has been, as you mentioned earlier, to get the growth model back on track as fast as possible. But the growth model on a finite planet is inherently unsustainable. So the challenge will be not to try to fix the growth model, but to move beyond the growth model. Again, politically, that doesn't seem to be digestible, and it seems to me that most cultures aren't yet ready for it, in the sense that if a politician were to come out and say we're going to move toward a degrowth economy or a steady state economy, then they would have a great challenge selling that to a voting public.
Well, essentially, they just wouldn't get elected. It's, people want to be told what they want to hear, even if, subconsciously they realize that things are very different. And I think that touches upon the one of the key issues here, perhaps the most fundamental one, and that is the psychological issues here. Our collective unconscious, what we believe, what we think, are quite often at odds with how things actually are. But it's an enormous hurdle to overcome. I think people adapting to different patterns of consumption and energy use would be physically very doable. We've seen a lot of different types of societies over the millennia. This, the one we have now is not the gold standard necessarily, but I think it's in our minds. I think that's the real battleground.
Yeah, I would agree. It's certainly part of the battleground, and you're quite right. For millennia, there have been philosophers telling us that our attitudes matter. How we experience the world is partly in our control, and if we can be victims of our attitudes, or we can be beneficiaries of them. And currently, when people conceive of the good life, they conceive of a high consumption, energy intensive life. And they think that if they don't achieve that, or if that's going to be taken away from them, then therefore they are having the good life taken away from them. And so far as those attitudes persist, then it follows that the transition away from industrial high consumption cultures is going to be experienced as loss and deprivation and sacrifice. But if we rethink that conception of a good life, if we think about, well, what does the good life really consist in? Is it limitless consumption, or was abundance, true abundance, a state of mind? Are the good things in life really free? Once we've attained our basic material needs, perhaps we should be directing our energies away from limitless material growth, material consumption, and to seek the good life in non-material sources of meaning and well-being and fulfillment, whatever they may be. It may be more time with family, it might be personal development, it might be more time reading, it might be more time dedicated to home production, it might be more time with community engagement, or spiritual contemplation, or political activity. There are any number of forms of fulfilling non-materialistic ways to live, once that sort of those basic needs have been met. And I guess one of the points I'm trying to make in this book is to highlight that we can live well with much less than what most people in the first world have. And it sort of applies just as well to other parts of the world, insofar as trying to reconceive what other parts of the world think of as progress. because if the global south aspires to turn itself into the global north, then that is a ecological catastrophe in the awaiting, and which is currently attempting to unfold. So just as the first world, or the high consumption lifestyles need to be reconsidered and to move toward an economy or a lifestyle of sufficiency, so too do those in the poorest parts of the world who quite justifiably want to increase their material standard of living, but that those forms of development mustn't aspire to the high consumption lifestyles, but to some notion of sufficiency. It's that middle way between overconsumption and underconsumption. And, returning to the idea of how important our attitudes are and mindfulness in these types of transitions. The great ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu once said, "He who knows he has enough is rich," which is interesting because it raises the point that wealth isn't a quantity of material goods, but sort of a conception of how much is needed. And just as he who knows he has enough is rich, it also implies, interestingly, that he who has enough but does not know it is poor. And it can be argued that many people in the rich world today who have everything they could possibly need in a material sense and yet still feel dissatisfied, eternally dissatisfied, despite their abundance, because they are constantly seeking more, however much they may have.
Now, even if industrial civilization and the advance of technology had delivered on its promise, that is to say, that we would all be having increasing leisure time and the mundane tasks that most of us don't really like to do, that those would be automated, and we'd all be living in a sort of Jetsons type techno utopia, as I mentioned earlier. Even if that had happened, it wouldn't have taken away the fundamental issues that, and in the book, the citizens in Entropia, they go about redesigning their food systems, how they do clothing, housing, transport, the whole gamut. And the main issue really is that they all contrast with the way we currently do things. Nothing is really the same model. It's a fundamental reinvention, or perhaps, going back to how things previously were done. So all the fundamentals that we have in industrial civilization really are built on sand. And I think the fact that we're not living in that techno-utopia now is kind of sending out signals to people. There is something wrong here. This isn't the future we ordered.
Yeah, you're quite right. And I decided to write the Entropia book when I was reading a book called Ecological Utopias by Marius de Grue. And he distinguishes utopias of sufficiency from utopias of abundance. And almost all utopias have been utopias of abundance, in which, like you say, everyone's rich, technology has solved all problems and has automated all those mundane tasks. And I wanted to write a sort of a utopia of sufficiency in the tradition of William Morris and Henry Thoreau, but to contextualize it in 21st century issues of decarbonisation in particular, and to try to conceive of a utopia of sufficiency that has tried to wean itself off fossil fuels, and to make the point that it is possible for us to move away from these high consumption, high energy and resource intensive lifestyles. And however much we give up in that transition, there is the prospect of having so much more return to us. And this arises out of a particular conception of human beings and the good life that I've been sort of talking about throughout our talk today. And it's the idea that every human being wants their basic needs met, but once those basic needs are met, there is the possibility of infinite variety of good, happy, meaningful, fulfilling lives that can be lived on those basic needs. We don't need all of the global travel or the global trade or the gadgets to live good, fulfilling, dignified lives. And in that sense, I see that there need not be any deprivation or sacrifice in the transition away from those high consumption lifestyles. Certainly, there are many things that we need to give up. But for everything we give up, if it's done wisely, if the transition is negotiated thoughtfully and wisely, we will have so much more return to us. I'm convinced that there is a better way to live than the high consumption, consumerist, fossil fuel based model. The question is how that transition is going to play out, and that remains to be seen.
The concept of Entropia is sort of an example of what's known as a resource-based economy. That is to say, you work with what you've actually got, not with what you'd like, and that you sort of take stock of what you have and then look at ways of using that sustainably so that that can keep you going indefinitely, and not just sort of burn through it and then say, okay, now what do we do? And if people sort of Google resource-based economy, they'll pretty quickly come across the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist movement. And most people are probably aware of what these guys are doing. And their vision of the future is certainly utopian. But, aesthetically, materially, it looks more, how shall I say, it's certainly much more equal than the society we have now. But it does seem to me, and I've been along to a lot of their meetings and looked at a lot of their material, it does seem to be entirely unrealistic, because it is that view that it's technology is going to fix everything, and it doesn't really address, even though they advocate, working with what they've got, it just doesn't seem that that's what the world's going to look like 100 years from now.
Yeah, I can't say I'm overly familiar with Zeitgeist, but I know the movement and have listened to some of the talks and read some of the literature, and my impression was exactly that sort of their critique seemed relatively well made and well directed, but the conception of the alternative struck me as wildly techno-optimist. Technology is an ambiguous term because the bone that was used as a needle is technology. The walking stick is technology in the sense of a tool that we use to help us live our lives. And so we will always have technology, even in the sustainable society, the justice society. Human beings will still use technology. The question is, some of the theorists use the term appropriate technology. And at the moment, if we can do something, it seems as if we feel we should. But the question is, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And it's a matter of perhaps thinking a bit more carefully about what technologies we use and to what end we put those technologies. Because I comment in the book that even if we were to transition to an economy based on, say, purely renewables, wind power, solar power, hydropower, that changes the means of economic activity, and it decarbonizes those means. But if it doesn't change the end, then we may be no better off. Obviously, if we decarbonize, we're better off in that sense. But a rainforest that's cut down with a chainsaw that was charged with renewable energy doesn't regrow any faster, and the biodiversity isn't affected any less just because the bulldozers ran on corn ethanol. Not only do we need to use appropriate technologies, but we also need to direct those technologies to sustainable and just ends. And I think one of my worries in the debate over renewables is that we get too focused on the attempt to decarbonize our economies, which is obviously a urgent and necessary part of the transition to a sustainable economy. But we can't just decarbonize. We actually have to rethink the growth model itself, because a growth model that is run on renewable energy is still a growth model, and on a finite planet that remains unsustainable by definition.
Now, one of the things that struck me about the Zeitgeist movement and similar sort of utopian visions is, where are all the belief systems? Where are the ideologies, the prejudices, the religion, the racism, all these other things that we contend with in global society? They're part of the aspect I mentioned earlier, the psychological aspect, and those can present enormous hurdles for us to get across in all of this, because what Zeitgeist, for example, is trying to do is just to be dispassionate view of where we are, where we want to be, how we can get there. And whether it's a political system, as I say, or whether it's fundamental religion, whatever, there's lots and lots of psychological barriers for us to cross.
Yeah, and I think will be one of the greatest challenges that will be put to communities and nations and the human community more generally in coming years is, in the face of crisis, how do we respond? Do we close up? Do we look purely to our own neighborhoods or to our own families and try to take what we need as desperately and as violently if need be? Or do we respond differently and more nobly and try to say, well, we're all in the boat, we're all in this together. We have to find out ways as a community to deal with these issues, because it's no good being the one person at the end of the street with all the stuff if the community around you is collapsing. So it will be a challenge, and how we respond is ultimately up to us. And there are signs of hope and there are signs of despair. That's a testament to our freedom, and how we exercise that freedom is one of the great ethical challenges that we as individuals and as communities and as nations are going to face when further crises strike, because it seems to me that for the reasons we've talked about, the growth model is coming to an end whether we want it or not. Presuming we don't voluntarily transition away, then we are going to grow ourselves to crisis. And perhaps that's where we are at now, in which case, we aren't going to be having some smooth transition to the sustainable and just society, if that transition occurs at all, but it's going to be one, as we talked about, punctuated with crises.
I think in terms of seeing how we might deal with some of the crisis situations that we've been speaking about, and perhaps being there now, I think there are a lot of things happening in the world at the minute that are direct manifestations of what we're talking about. They're just not being seen that way. They're not being called honestly. And I think you can look at, for example, what's happening in Egypt now, and you can make the case that that's got to do with energy and resources. The problems in that country at their root do not have a political solution, and that's what we're seeing now is the change of government, the military coup that's just happened. Basically, Egypt has got enormous population expansions been happening and projected to go on. They're importing increasing amounts of food. They basically can't feed themselves. Greater numbers of I think it was 40% of the population live below the poverty line on $2 or $3 a day. And their oil resources have gone down greatly. They've sold most of it. They can no longer pay their international debts. And put all that together, and you've got a problem that does not have a political solution. And I think that people keep one eye on that. And the Middle East is particularly affected by this because they've got, real problems with growing food and with water. And some of them have still got tons of oil, of course, and that's fine and dandy. But I think really that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, and I guess the broader point is that energy descent, or reaching the limits to growth, are going to have political implications. When economies stop growing and debts stop being repaid and people find themselves in dire economic straits, this provides some of the cultural foundations for political unrest, and it could well be what we should expect to see more of as economies stagnate and contract, as energy surpluses dry up, as economies stop growing, as economies contract. These have political implications. When people are hungry, they're more likely to go to the streets. And like you say, it could be what we're seeing in Europe and in Greece, in Spain. Different parts of the world are in the process of experiencing, arguably, the implications of an economic system running up against its limits. It could be a sign of things to come, even in places that we don't currently expect in the more stable, traditionally Western societies.
Perhaps, Sam, we should wrap up today just on a hopeful note, because really, if we don't believe that there is a positive future for us, then kind of like, what's the point? And it's in our human nature, I think, to to be optimistic, and it's just a case now really, can we stop being blindly optimistic? Can we just a different type of optimism and hope for the future? I mean, what do you see out there really as positive developments?
I'm speaking from Australia, and we are soon to be having an election, and the evidence so far seems to suggest that Tony Abbott of the Liberals is going to be voted in, and he's hasn't got a progressive bone in his body. And what this suggests to me is that all of these problems that we've been talking about are off the radar in terms of the political culture in Australia, but also in Britain, as far as I can tell, and in the States and in Western Europe and all of these advanced industrial nations. The political culture, by which I mean top-down political culture, Parliament, the executive, the judiciary, don't seem to be thinking about responding to these crises. At least they're not trying to transition away from the model that has caused them, but is trying to fix the model that has caused them. But it's trying to fix an unfixable model. So my point is that if it's the case that we're not going to get these transitions from the top down, it follows that the solution, if there is to be one, must be driven from the grassroots, from below. And the most inspiring movements that I see emerging, out of the UK, where you are, is the Transition Towns movement, because it seems to me that that type of model of social change, where communities get together and enjoy the process of transition by reskilling, by growing their own food, by enjoying the process of education and finding fulfillment in community and engagement. It strikes me that that type of model is the most likely means of bringing about the social change that we need. And although the transition movement, although expanding and although doing a lot, it still remains quite a small subculture. But what gives me greatest hope is thinking of, historical social movements. Take the civil rights movement, for example. People sitting around in their garages in the early 50s could not have imagined what would have occurred by the middle of the 60s, only 15 years later. As promising as the transition movement is, at the moment it's not making a huge amount of impact at the structural level. But if we imagine the transition movement as being very much in its infancy, and that if we are to transition away from the growth model and the industrial model that we've been talking about, that transition movement has to somehow enter the mainstream and transform the mainstream, and then at that stage there may be hope of changing the structures of society, because it's ultimately those structures that need to be changed. Changing the culture within a growth, a model and structures of growth aren't going to solve our problems. So it's not enough to try to escape the system. Ultimately, the political goal must be to transform the system. And while the transition movement at the moment is often criticized as being apolitical in the sense that it doesn't, campaign for a political party, I think that is strategic in the sense that the culture needs to change before there is any hope of top-down political change. As I said, in Australia, we are about to have a narrow-minded conservative who isn't going to solve but only exacerbate all of the problems we've been talking about. So to try to wait for our politicians to do something, well, that's not going to happen. To try to do it, to try to bring about the change at the personal level, that will seem overwhelming. But the transition movement is saying, well, what if we came together as a community, as a neighborhood, as a street, as a suburb, as a city or a town? What if we came together at the grassroots level and say, well, we're going to have to do this ourselves, and we can have fun doing it. And the transition movement is providing many inspiring examples of the first steps in the transition taking place. And like I say, we need to envision the transition movement expanding, organising, radicalising, and then once that's happened, that's when we can hope that perhaps the structures of society will change and we move towards something other than the growth model. We decarbonise, we relocalise economies, and a very strong motivation for writing Entropia was to ask the question, well, what would life look like if the transition movement succeeded? Entropia is the best answer I can offer.
Well, just in closing, Sam, perhaps you'd like to share, once again, details of the book, websites, just anything else you'd like to put out there.
So the book's called Entropia. It's available at its website, entropia.com. I blog at thesimplicitycollective.com, and my academic essays are listed at thesimplicityinstitute.org with my colleagues Dr. Simon Usher and Dr. Ted Trainer, and we talked a lot about attitudes and mindfulness today, and listeners might be interested in looking at some of Mark Birch's work on the Simplicity Institute website, who has done some really magnificent, deep, profound work on mindful sufficiency and the importance of mindfulness in this transition. So I'd encourage you to look at the Simplicity Institute website. I hope your listeners find things there that they enjoy and are enriched by.
Excellent. Well, Sam, once again, thank you so much for joining us today on legalisefreedom.com.
Nice speaking with you, Greg.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalisefreedom.com, legalise-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalisefreedom.com.